Shalom, Lila Tov. Happy Wednesday night to you. Before I get started, I'm supposed to create a commercial letting everybody know about NETIV. NETIV is what we're on YouTube, or at least I know we're on YouTube, but I guess we're on various other sites. But on Facebook, you can go to the NETIV site and actually go through all the back articles or programs that are there. There you'll find lots of opportunities. Some really great guys are on there. So take advantage of it if you would. And from that, let's get started. So we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 5 this time. And again, there'll be some background information I think I really want to get across to you. And at the same time, try to especially cover the idea of the 70 years, Daniel's 70-year story, because Daniel is now approaching, we'll go through this. Nebuchadnezzar would rule for 45 years. At the end of his 45 years, according to the book of the Talmud, Megillah 11b, at the end of his life, he was replaced by his son, Evil Merodach. Evil. I simply would refer to it as evil Murdoch, but it's Evil. He rules for 23 years, or that is how it's listed. Now, after him comes what we're studying now, and that's the chapters of Belshazzar. Those are 2 years that he's going to serve. So if you are looking for a 70-year clock, which is what Jeremiah is looking for because of Jeremiah, or what Daniel's looking for because of what Jeremiah had sent out. And so we've now reached at this point 70 years, which is also part of the reason for this celebration that we're going to talk about tonight. It's not simply about the victory over the Medo-Persians that day, but it's also about the end of the 70-year period. So keep that in mind. Now, understand, Jeremiah would wear a yoke in Jerusalem, indicating that Jerusalem should go into captivity, that life would be okay for them if they did. Well, the first couple of years were not so great for many of them who went into captivity, among those first thousands that were going there. Some of them said that, life was rough. The Chaldeans were cruel. But at the same time, Israel no longer had to deal with evil kings. Remember, the kings towards the ends after Josiah were a downhill. It was not historically great times for them. Also, during that time, while they were in Babylon, the sages, the scholars, actually developed the Babylonian Talmud, and actually they began to create a justice system within Babylon that would dealt with all of the Jews. So time was not exactly opposed to them. They're also going to develop many, many cities in Iraq, or at that time it was just simply Babylon. And I'll interchange the two names because we're going to get into, when we get into chapter 7, I'm going to talk to you about the ancient times, and I'm going to talk to you about modern day Daniel 7. So this idea of growth will actually occur here. Now, they're also going to find out that in this period in time, Israel is going to move from the Hebrew language to the Aramaic, the more common language. Now, this more common language is going to actually cause problems in the sense that they will be able to assimilate much more easily into the Babylonian culture. In fact, many of them, according to some of the rabbis, were actually doing that. They came there for the purpose of converting in order to develop wealth, because Babylon was the center of the world at that point in time. So it became very, very significant. So we begin with that in mind, and now I want you to go to the first verse. So this is King Belshazzar. He's made a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine before them, before the 1,000 guests. Now, this feast for 1,000, according to the Midrashic writings, was based upon something that had happened that day. According to this story, that is understood. Babylon had just fought off the Medo-Persian Empire. Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Great, who was a Persian, invaded Babylon, and they had reached the gates of the city. Now, before they reached the gates of the city, understand it was like most other sieges that went on. They first off took care of all the small villages around it, eliminating all of the possible enemies from outside before they attacked what was going on inside. Now, in doing so, going through this process, they found themselves north and south of the city of Babylon. Babylon was considered to be unbreachable. No one could get through the walls. The walls were thick enough that they actually could run 7 chariots across the top of the wall. So you're not going to beat the wall down. The gates were made of iron, so you were not going to break through the gates. And there was a second line of gates and bridge and wall once you got through the first line. So it was a very impregnable city. The only thing that made it pregnable was the fact that the Euphrates River flowed right underneath the gates and underneath the walls through the city and out again. But that was their water supply. So they continued to collect water through that reservoir. After driving the what appeared to be the Medo-Persian Empire from the south away, chasing them to the point where they no longer were visible, they came back, and that's when the celebration was going to begin. But at the same point in time, that didn't take care of the group of the Medo-Persians that were to the north of the city, and they began to reroute the river so that it no longer flowed. Many people said they just simply dammed the river. Others said no, they simply rerouted it and created a lake out there. But any way you look at it, the water began to lower itself. So by the evening watch, they could literally walk under the wall. And again, back to the Midrashic writings, it said that the water was no deeper than their ankles by the time they entered in. Once they were underneath the walls, they simply sieged the wall, the inner walls, which were much shorter, much thinner, and were able to climb the walls and attack from within. Now, according to the stories, the whole battle took less than hours. In fact, according to many, there was only one casualty, and that was Belshazzar. He was the only one who died. It was a bloodless battle, as they would put it. Literally, there was no one else that was going to die. So he's having a feast right now to celebrate the fact that they've pushed away the Medo-Persians, when in actuality, that was not the case. So he's invited 1,000 of his closest friends, and they're sitting at the table. What's unusual about this table is if we look at the second verse, it begins by saying, while under the influence of wine. And I want you to note that while under the influence of wine. The Hebrew actually says that the wine suggested to him. The wine will suggest to him. That'll become important when we begin to understand what it suggested. So the wine suggested to him, and Belshazzar gave an order to bring the golden and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, and if you notice, if it's in your book too, grand is in parenthesis, because there is no Aramaic word for grandfather. You are the son of a son of a son. That would be how you would be identified. You would be the son of. So in this particular case, it's identifying Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, or his grandson. Some believe he was actually his son. It was actually his second son or his third son, but that's still not clear to everybody. So he removed from the sanctuary that was in Jerusalem for the king and his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines. Females were never invited to a banquet. This was highly unusual. So the wine was beginning to cause him to become delusional, if nothing else. And so as they're beginning to go through this whole process, one of the things that's now happening is that he's now ordering, or it's been told to him to bring the vessels by the wine. Now, the vessels weren't there. The vessels were in a building across the street in what would be called a storage facility. And he's only going to bring the golden vessels from the temple. He won't bring the silver. So you imagine taking care of 1,000 guests with just the golden vessels and plates that would be found in Jerusalem in the temple area. So it was quite extensive. Now he goes on to say, so they brought the gold vessels that they removed from the sanctuary of the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his consorts and his concubines drank from them. Now they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, copper, iron, wood, and stone. So these are the things that are going to happen. They're celebrating the victory, but there was another victory in his back of his mind. That was the victory of the 70 years. Because you remember, according to our understanding of Jeremiah, which was never correct, 70 years they would be in captivity. And we always assumed the 70 years began with the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, actually, Nebuchadnezzar sieged the city not when he first became king, but a year later. So this is really the 69th year, not the 70th year. But he begins by going to grab the vessels because he thinks God no longer has control over the situations. Many, many countries were worried about Israel getting back together again because of their God. And so they took it quite seriously. But now under the influence of wine, having beaten off the Medo-Persians and now thinking the 70 years were up because he's now beginning his third year in office. And again, his year began the same time as the year of the Israelites. So it's the month of Tishri, the first month at this point. So we're watching what's going on. At this point in time, after everybody has become more drunk, we read in verse 5, just then the fingers of a human hand came forth and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, facing the candelabrum or the window, and the king saw that the palm of the hand that was writing. Didn't see the arm. All he saw was the palm of the hand, and it was writing, and not in Crayola. According to the words, it was actually etching into the wall. So it was actually more permanent. Now, according to Saddam Hussein, who's reconstructed the city of Babylon, that room is now there again. And so he's rebuilt that room to that exact size. And so you can imagine a room that contains 1,000 people, and all of them are able to see the hand. So it's not a small hand. It's a rather large hand etching into the plaster the words. Now he goes on to say in verse number 6, the king's appearance thereupon changed, and his thoughts bewildered him. The belt around his waist opened, and his knees knocked one against the other. Now, this is a polite way of saying something rather different. I want you to go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 45. Isaiah chapter 13 and chapter 14 in Isaiah are about Babylon, but we're going to read a little bit about the character called Cyrus the Persian. And maybe I should preempt my story by giving you some more information about Cyrus. Now, according to this story, Darius the Mede will be the one in charge as they take over the city. In fact, he will make Babylon the capital city for the Medes. His son-in-law was called Cyrus the Great. That's his son-in-law. And his son-in-law lived in Elam, which is today modern-day Iran. And so the Medes, which are more like the Kurdish people that would have been at the northern ends of Iraq, Those people are the Medes. They came, they conquered. Now we know chapter 6 will be about Darius the Mede. So will chapter 9 talk to us about Darius the Mede. So we're going to see this character again. Now Darius is only going to rule for less than 1 year. Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar is now entering his 3rd year, and that 3rd year will conclude not with Darius, but it will conclude with Cyrus the Persian. So there'll be 3 different rulers within the course of a year. And these 3 rulers will make up that 1 year that was missing from our 70-year story. Remember, Daniel or Jeremiah prophesied 70 years, and that will happen in that 3rd year. But if you're looking at Isaiah chapter 45 at this point in time, one of the things I want you to notice is God wrote a personal letter to Cyrus the Persian. This personal letter starts in verse number 24. And maybe we'll just start and I'll read this letter to you and talk to you about it. Now, this personal letter is written in such an interesting way. Notice how it begins. Thus said Hashem, your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. Do you remember how God described Jeremiah? How soon did he know him? From the womb. Now, these 2 characters have something in common. Now, I, Hashem, who has made everything and who spread out the heavens by myself and firmed the earth of my own accord, who abrogates the omens of the stargazers and makes fools of the astrologers, who makes wise men retreat, makes their knowledge foolish, and who confirms the words of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, it shall be settled, and the cities of Judah. So here he's beginning to tell us he is now the one who's deciding that the cities are going to be filled. Who has he chosen to do that? Cyrus the Persian, or better known as Cyrus the Great. He was known as a tremendous king by all standards. He was considered to be a magnificent general. He was considered to be an extraordinary scholar. He had everything going for him. The people loved him because his rule was fair and just, and there was no what they would call evil going on. Now, it goes on to say, it shall be settled in the cities of Judah, and they shall be built up, and I will rebuild its ruins. Who says to the depths, dry up, and I shall dry out your rivers. What rivers? The river called the Euphrates. He's already telling him the battle plan. This is how you're going to get in. He goes on to say, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will fulfill all my desires. To say of Jerusalem, it shall be built, and of the temple, it shall be established. He, notice, fulfills my desires. He is my shepherd. Notice verse 45:1. This is where we run into some problems, because modern scholars say that this was written now by a 3rd Isaiah, somebody who lived during the days of the Persians. So that's what he's talking to, but it's not. Thus said Hashem to his anointed. The Hebrew word would be Mashiach. He is my Mashiach. He is my Messiah. So when we talk about the Messiah yet to come, it is one who has been anointed to come, just as Cyrus was anointed to come. The word anointed is used 38 times in the Tanakh. Of the 38 times, it's used 33 times to identify Levites and Cohen. The other times are for things like this, like David, and now here for the character called Cyrus. So he is to be the anointed one. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have kings to open doors before him, and that gateways not be shut. I will go before you and straighten the twisting paths. I will smash copper doors and sever iron bolts. And I will grant you the treasures of darkness and the hidden treasures of secret places, in order that you should know that I am Hashem, who has proclaimed your chosen one, or has proclaimed you as the chosen one. I am Hashem, and there is no other. Now, understand then, let's go back to that first verse. And I want you to look specifically after he grasped to subdue nations before him. Notice the next line, that I might loosen their loins. What does it mean to loosen their loins? Sarcastically, it's to have a bowel movement. Now, why do I say that? Go back to Daniel. Go back to that chapter 5, and I want you to look at the verse, about his waist. 3 things happened as he is going through this. Why am I not seeing it? Okay. 6. The king's appearance thereupon changed, and his thoughts bewildered him. Actually, the word is troubled. The belts around his waist opened. What would happen if the belts around your waist open? They would drop. What would cause them to drop? The Midrash says it's the same thing. So his knees knocked one against another. Now the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldean stargazers and the demonists. And the king exclaimed to the sages of Babylonia that any person who would read this writing and tell its interpretation would wear royal purple with a chain of gold on his neck. Key verse. And would, my art scroll says, rule 1/3 of the kingdom. Actually, the more literal translation would be ruler, the third ruler of the kingdom. Now, I stress that because I have to go back to, again, historical records. Actually, the third king of Babylon was not Belshazzar, but Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus. Nabonidus was actually the third king. But Nabonidus was so hated that he never ruled from Babylon. In fact, he put his son Belshazzar in charge, and he went off to fight wars. So when he says that you're going to be the third in line, that's because Belshazzar was technically the second in line. That's where it comes from. So as we continue on through, it says, then all the king's sages came in, but they could not read the writing and make its interpretation known to the king. Now then King Belshazzar was greatly bewildered, and his appearance changed upon him, and his nobles were confounded. As the consequence of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen came. Now the queen was already there, so this is not the same queen that we're talking about. This was probably Nebuchadnezzar's wife, because remember, he was already there with his queens and concubines. So the queen came into this banquet hall. The queen explained it and said, may the king live forever. Do not be bewildered, nor let your appearance be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit, notice, in whom the spirit of the holy God, and in your grandfather's days, brilliance, understanding, and wisdom like the wisdom of God were found in him. What's it tell you about her understanding of who Daniel was? She saw God as God. I guess if I were to give her a title, I would call her a B'nai Noach. Now, it goes on to say, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, made him chief of the necromancers, astrologers, Chaldean stargazers, the demonists. Since the ordinary spirit, intelligence, understanding, interpreting of dreams, solving of riddles, and resolving of difficulties have been found in Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, not Belshazzar, but Belteshazzar. So we understand that Belteshazzar was the name of Nebuchadnezzar's god originally. Later, it would become God who would be his God. So let Daniel now be called, and he will relate the interpretation. So they go out and they call Daniel to come. Daniel, obviously, by this time has either been retired or was retired forcibly, but he's no longer a part of the group. Then Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke up and said to Daniel, "You are Daniel from among the people of the exile of Judah, whom the king, my grandfather, brought from Judah. I have heard about you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that brilliance and understanding and extraordinary wisdom are found in you. The sages, the astrologers, were now brought before me to read the writing and make an interpretation known to me, but they could not tell me the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you are able to provide interpretations and resolve the difficulties. Now, if you will be able to read the writing and make its interpretation known to me, you will wear a royal purple with a chain of gold on your neck, and you will be the third of the kingdom." Daniel then replied and said to the king. Now, Daniel must have walked into the room and was able to identify what was going on, because he would have looked around the room to see what's going on, and there would still be a buzz in the air. But as he looked, according to the room was long, and one wall that was opposed to the windows, the one wall was the wall where the candelabras would have been set. He would have seen the writing on this wall. So he walks in, he sees the writing, he listens to Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar's asked him to be the third in the kingdom if you can interpret it, and look what he says. "Let your gifts remain yours, and give your rewards to others. But I will read the writing for the king and make its interpretation known to him. You, O king, the supreme God gave kingship. So you're there because God gave it to you. Greatness, honor, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather." So who actually was he praising? Not Belshazzar, but his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages used to tremble and be frightened before him. Whomever he wished he would kill, and whomever he wished he would keep alive, and whomever he wished he would raise up, and whomever he wished he would put down. But when his heart grew proud and his spirit was hardened to rebel, he was deposed from the royal throne. Remember, that was last chapter. And the honor was taken away from him. He was driven from mankind, and his heart was made like a beast. His dwelling was with the wild asses, and they fed him grass like oxen. And his body was washed with the dew of the heavens until he recognized that he was the supreme God who rules over the kingdoms of men, and that whomever he wishes, he appoints over it. So he has now given him the moral lesson of what's going on tonight. The lesson is he learned about what arrogance gets you when God is involved. It gets you nowhere. Notice the verse. But you, his grandson Belshazzar, did not humble your heart, Although you knew all this, he knew the history. He knew what his grandfather was. I'm sure there were many statues still in Babylon commending him and identifying him as a great leader. Now you exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. How did he do that? And the vessels of his house were brought before you, and you and your nobles, your consorts, and your concubines drank wine from them. And you praised the gods of silver, gold, copper, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor know. But the God whose hand is in your soul, and to whom all your ways belong, you did not glorify. Thus, the palm of the hand was sent from before him, and it scribed its writing on this wall. So the hand was the right hand. No, it was the left hand. If you were looking at our flag and you looked at the eagle on the back of the flag, you notice that the eagle has talons. Do you recognize what's in each of those talons? And one of its talons was arrows, war. Now, on the other hand, was an olive branch, peace. Which hand would God have been demonstrating to Belshazzar what was about to happen? His left hand. He was presenting to him a slap across the face. And he wrote it in such a way, not because he's left-handed. That's an amorphic term. He has no hands. But that's what they saw. But he wrote to him a very specific phrase. Now, there are lots of ways that this phrase has been looked at. It's about this time when Hebrew is beginning to diminish and Aramaic is coming. But it's also about this time when the calligraphy, the writing itself, was beginning to change. It was moving away from the more hieroglyphic picture to an actual word or a letter. Wasn't perfect, but it was a moving towards. That's what the scholars are saying, that what was happening was the fact that they couldn't recognize the letters. So therefore, they couldn't recognize the word. Others said it was not that at all. In fact, they would say, well, turn in your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, chapter 25. I like to make sure everybody knows that there's lots of parts of the Bible. So in chapter 25, and I want you to look at verse number 2. It begins by saying, it is the honor of God to do what? To conceal the matter. But it is the honor of kings to search out the matter. God has created something that requires a searching. That's what they're saying is going on. Now, we know, and I have a book on my shelf from Avraham Trugman talking about the 70 different ways the scriptures can be written, and lots of different ways that are happening. 2 of them have been identified as possibilities for what's going on because we don't have the actual handwriting on the wall to look at. Actually, there's 3. The second one, the most common one, is it says that it was written in 3-letter blocks. So 3 letters, 3 letters, 3 letters, 3 letters, meaning that they would have to read across lines. The other possibility was, as they were looking at this, one of the things that they came with is what's called the albam, in which the alphabet goes A through L, which is 11 letters. And the second 11 letters are moved over underneath. And so you now have the letter Lamed. Actually, it's Lamed all the way across. So it's Aleph, Lamed would be together. And then the next letters would be Yeah, Bet Mem. That was another way that they said you could look at it. Another way you can look at it is called Atbash. Atbash simply says you take the first 11 letters and you take, and right below it, you begin to write the next letter and you go backwards. So now you have Aleph over Tav, and you have Bet over Shin. In the book of Jeremiah, why don't you turn to Jeremiah for a second, chapter 51. Again, everybody's Bible needs to get a workout. So go to chapter 51. In chapter 51, we're looking at a situation. Where's my Shishak? Towards the end. Well, oh, here it is. Verse 41. Verse 41. How has Shishak been captured and the glory of the whole world seized? How has Babylon become a desolation among the nations? Now, this is a prophecy concerning Babylon, not now, but at the end. And in fact, sometime I think I want to try to teach you chapters 50 and 51 and the Iran-Iraq War, or the Iran War, Desert Storm and Desert Shield, because that's in chapter 50 and 51. So God has concealed lots of things, but Shishak is the important thing. Now, there's literally only 3 letters in the word. The first letter is Shin, second letter is Shin, third letter is Het. So when you look at it and you do Atbash, where Shin is, right above it is the letter Bet. So it's Bet, Bet, and where the Kaf is, right above it is the letter Lamed. Babel. How has Babel been captured? That's part of Desert Storm. Now, back to our story. So there's many ways that we can look at this set of words. It begins in 25 by saying, this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now you'll find these in the book of Sanhedrin, chapter 21b. That's where you'll find the folio on this. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene means counted. God has counted the years of your kingship and determined it. So his years of kingship will be 2 years plus. Tekel, which means weighed. You have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Now, a scale is called a tashkel. On that tashkel is a shekel. That's the coinage. That's the weights that were used also. Peretz. You have been weighed and found wanting. Peretz, you are broken up. Peretz is to break through. Your kingdom has been broken and given to Media first and Persia. Those two will actually have it. Now understand then, his kingdom is taken away tonight. End. In other words, it ends very abruptly, but it ends. It's taken up immediately by the Medes, Darius the Persian, or Darius the Mede. Darius is going to lead. His son-in-law is second in command, but his son-in-law does not want to remain just second. Later that year, Cyrus the Persian will have a coup in which Darius will die. And he will replace him. When it's all said and done, Cyrus's kingdom will go all the way to the Aegean Sea, right to the land of Greece, Macedonia. And it'll go all the way the other direction, all the way to the Indus River, leading into the nation of India. That will be the kingdom of Persia. Now, in the beginning of that, Cyrus the Persian will actually rule from Babylonia. Now, during that same time, he will be building his palace in Susa. And he will go back and forth between the two because you see the climate in Susa was very cold. And so he, like many Floridians, are actually what? Snowbirds, right? They move from place to place. Cyrus will practice being a snowbird. He will practice going from one to the other, back and forth. But his kingdom will be immense all the way across. He'll be succeeded by a character called Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus will be the king that we would recognize with Esther and Mordecai. After Ahasuerus passes away, the next king would have been Ahasuerus' son, who came by way of Esther. So Darius the Persian is actually going to be a half Jew. But anyway, that's beyond the point. So the story then gives us the fact that it's not an end to a story, but it's a beginning. It's going to roll us into chapter 7. And when we get to chapter 7, we're going to study the Babylonian Empire, and we'll study the Medo-Persian Empire, and we're going to study the Greek Empire, and we'll study the Roman Empire. Then after that, we will study the English Empire, and we will study the empire that belongs to the Russians. And then we're going to study the empire that belongs to the Germans. And then we'll study the empire of the very last days. There's a lot to be learned in these chapters, but you have to pull history and you have to take and look carefully because God is hidden in his text more and more and more. Now notice the last verses. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel in a purple robe with a chain of gold on his neck. And they proclaimed about him that he would rule or be the third ruler in all of this. But again, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Slain by whom? I told you it was a bloodless war, that there would only be one person who died. That'll be Belshazzar. You see, his 1,000 guests will offer him up. In fact, they will offer him up in pieces. They will cut off his head and offer it to Darius the Mede. And then they will offer the rest of his body to him. Not exactly the way you would want to die. But that will be the end of the kingdom of Babylon. Babylon then will simply become part of history at that point in time as we move to the next. Babylon itself was never destroyed by the Medo-Persian invasion. It was never destroyed by the invasion of the Greeks. We will find that Alexander the Great actually used it as a command center. So Babylon will remain for centuries after all of this is done. But again, we're looking at the end of the first of the kingdoms. Remember, there were 4, the head of gold. Then we move to silver, which is the Medo-Persian Empire. Then we'll move to the brass, which is the Greeks. And then we'll move down to the Romans, which is the last of the empires before the ends. Okay. You let me talk for 45 minutes and chase you around the Bible a little bit. My wife said I'm too quick, but does anybody have a thought, something they want to know about? And I owe Mike, who's not here, one thought, but I'll give that after. Anybody?